Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to a banner review on the upcoming 4.8 Phase 1 banners. We have Navia and Nilou both rerunning with Kirara, Kaveh, and Ninggaung as the 4-star options. I have already recorded an Ask the Jeff Navia, and I think I will record an Ask the Jeff Nilou. So I'm not going to go too much into detail when it comes to them, but I'll still be giving you enough that you get a decent idea for what my thoughts are. But obviously, if you want to know more about them, you should check out those videos. They'll probably be released after this one, so make sure you subscribe. As usual, let's start with the 5-star characters and talk about them before we get into the 4 stars and then the weapons. First, Navia, and this is actually interesting because these are actually 2 characters that I think are relatively strong and I do not have. Navia is a Geo carry that isn't really Geo. She kind of likes Geo Resonance, but that's really the only thing she cares that much about when it comes to Geo. She is a character that wants to trigger Crystallize, or wants your team to trigger Crystallize, but she triggers it by herself more than enough when it comes to her requirements for Crystallize, which means that you actively want to play her with characters of other elements that will let you trigger the Crystallize. You don't really want to play her with a lot of other Geo characters. You mostly play her with other Geo characters because they give you Geo Resonance, which is actually quite good, and they give you Geo Particles, which help her ER requirements a lot. She's a skill-focused carry, right? Her skill does a pretty big chunk of damage and does more damage after you've triggered Crystallize, so you want to make sure you trigger Crystallize, and her burst's purpose is to trigger that Crystallize. You guys know what Navia does, and if you don't, you can check out my post-release video on her. So let's talk about how good she is at what she does. She is definitely in the upper half of characters. She's a character that if you just look at sheets, she's okay. She's not outstanding, but she has a very valuable thing, which is the fact that she is a skill-focused character who does most of her damage through her skill, and her skill has multiple charges. What that means is that unlike a skill that would have double the cooldown, right? 18-second cooldown that you can use twice, you can use a third skill 9 seconds after you've used the first one. A lot like Xiao's skill. When it comes to Xiao, that doesn't matter that much because you don't want to use your skill during your ult, because he's not a skill-focused character. When it comes to Navia, though, you set up your buffs, you swap into her, you use your first skill, you do a little bit of damage, you use your second skill, and then before your uptime is over, the cooldown of your first skill can come back up and you can use it again. And the fact that she's a skill-focused carry with a skill that has multiple charges makes it so that she is able to effectively borrow one skill from her next rotation. Usually, you have your timeline or whatever. If it didn't have charges, you would use your first skill at time is equals 0. This would be your first skill. Then 9 seconds later, you could use your second. Then 9 seconds later, use your third, etc. If it was an 18-second that you could use twice, you would use your first one at 0. Then your second one at 18. Then your third one at 36. But it being 2 charges with 9 seconds means that even though the overall DPS, if you were to only look at it from a perspective of, oh, she does this every 9 seconds, let's calculate the damage it does and say that it happens every 9 seconds, right? What ends up happening is you use your first one at time equals 0, your second one around 4 seconds later, and then your third one around 5 actually seconds later at times equal 9. And then you could use the next one another 9 seconds later, but in practice what you generally end up doing is before this time right here, this is where you do your setup, and then after this is where you do your setup for the next rotation, which means that you then have your next 2 skills. Yeah, effectively it makes it so that, right, that baseline, if you were to use every 9 seconds, that would look like this. Well, she effectively gets 1 more in here. And that means that her first rotation does more damage by effectively borrowing a skill from your next rotation. And because she's a skill-focused carry that does a very good portion of her damage through her skill, getting 1 more skill in your first rotation is a pretty big increase to her damage in the first rotation. And in a game that is a DPS check where most enemies are balanced around dying after a well-invested team's first rotation, maybe 2 rotations, being able to borrow from your next rotation like that, in practice, means that she just does more damage than, she does more DPS than she would over a longer period of time. What that means is that despite having performance that if you're looking only at the sheets, which calculate the DPS over an infinite amount of time, effectively, you calculate a sustained rotation, and you calculate the DPS of that sustained rotation, her ability to front load some additional damage into her first rotation makes her significantly overperform in practice. Which means that she is actually a character that has quite good performance. She's one of the characters that people quite like using for high investment speedruns, even looking at free-to-play speedruns. Or not necessarily free-to-play, but like non-whale speedruns. She's a character that a lot of people like using. But yeah, I get into this in a lot more detail in the Ask the Jeff Navia video, which don't forget to subscribe and you can check out. But overall, I would say that Navia is one of the characters that, I mean, if you don't like her, she is not one of the insane best carries. She's not on the same level as a character like Navia. So skipping her will not put you in a situation where you feel like you're missing out on a great carry if you're going for another carry instead. However, she definitely is a character that if you do decide to go for her, you will most likely be satisfied with her overall performance. I don't like calling DPS characters or like carries great pulls in general, because I think that as a general rule, it's more important that you focus on having a strong roster of supports than it is to have strong carries. Mainly because if you only ever focus on having strong carries and you get every new strong carry, well, most of the carries you get are going to end up benched because you can only have 2 teams in Abyss. However, within the carries, she's definitely one of the better ones. Next up, let's talk about Nilou. She has gotten a treatment that is the exact opposite than what Ayaka and Venti have gotten over the years, which is that since her release, the Abyss content has actually catered to her more than it did before her release. And the main reason for that isn't really that they phased out single target enemies, but rather that they have increased the difficulty of the AoE chambers, but they haven't really increased the difficulty of the single target ones. I'd say that when it comes to single target chambers, the hardest one we've had is probably just the Winot boss, which was released a little bit after her, but since then, Abyss difficulty has more so been focused on high HP multi-wave AoE content, which is actually content where Nilou is great. When I say difficulty in this case, I'm specifically talking about the DPS check, not any sort of mechanical difficulty. Anyways, Nilou's biggest strength has always been how her teams perform in AoE, and her biggest weakness has always been how her teams perform in single target. But the thing is, she has a specific power level, which is generally just barely enough at medium level investment to be able to do the harder single target sides while still having enough time on the second side for your other chambers, as long as it's not like a bad matchup for the second chamber. And the main reason why when she was released, I emphasized so much on her single target weakness was because through the years, single target content, at least up to her release, had gotten more and more difficult, with bosses having more stalling mechanics and higher HP pools. But after her release, that just hasn't really happened. And so her relative weakness in single target hasn't really been that big of a deal, because by the time you have the damage you need to clear what is now significantly tankier AoE chambers with her, you probably also have enough damage to clear the Magukenki chamber. She's still not the main character I would recommend for your single target side, but because the single target difficulty hasn't really gone up too much, using her isn't actually that big of a problem. And again, right, because the difficulty of the AoE Abyss chambers has gone up, then her upside, what she is good at, is arguably more important now than it was when she came out. The one thing that is really, really important to know, though, if you are planning on playing Nilou, is that Nilou without Nahida just is not the same unit. Nilou is probably the unit that is the most reliant on Nahida in the whole game. And if you don't have Nahida, you will honestly struggle a little bit in the AoE content where she's best, and you will not have a good time at all in single target content. And that mainly boils down to the fact that without Nahida, you generally just don't have the dendro necessary to reliably have your Hydro units be the one to be triggers. You can use her with Alhaitham too. There are some non-Nahida Alhaitham teams with Nilou, but one, they tend to be harder to play, and two, there are not that many people that have Alhaitham and don't have Nahida and want to improve their Alhaitham by pigeonholing him into a Nilou team. Anyways, I just want to make it very clear, like, if you don't have Nahida and you're planning on getting Nilou, you should save up your primos after that until there's a Nahida rerun, because it's going to make her feel significantly better. I'd say that without Nahida, Nilou is still a playable unit, but I definitely would not put her anywhere close to the level that she is with Nahida. With all of that said about single target, do keep in mind, this is the sort of stuff that is entirely up to Hoyo. They are 100% adding a lot of new bosses in that one, right? It's a new area, there's going to be new bosses. They very well could decide, hey, these bosses are going to have really long stalling mechanics or incredibly high HP pools, and we're putting them in Abyss. We know for a fact there will be new bosses that will be put in Abyss. It is very possible that those new bosses continue that trend that hasn't really been too bad in Fontaine, but that was definitely the case up to Sumeru, where new bosses tended to have higher HP pools and more stalling mechanics. And if they do, we could get to that point where even the good Nilou teams without key or something like that would end up clearing the chambers a bit too slow for your other side to be able to really get through. At the end of the day, that's something that can happen to any unit though. Like a unit's strength could just be completely negated by the sort of content that they decide to put in Abyss. But I do want to mention that as a possibility because I talked about how at least so far it hasn't been the case. When it comes to her, like the rest of her team outside of Nahida, the most popular, the most common core is one other Hydro and one other Dendro. The main reason for that is because two other Hydros, right, with a triple Hydro, is generally so much Hydro application that even Nahida by herself can't keep up as Aura. And once you lose your Dendro Aura and you start having a Hydro Aura, you will trigger a lot less blooms overall. If you do that, it's still doable, but that's generally when you start on-fielding Nahida instead of having her off-field, and it generally starts being worse in AoE situations because Nahida's Dendro app in like as an on-fielder, what she gains is single target app when you put her on field, not really AoE app. But yeah, so most of the time it's double Hydro, double Dendro teams with one dedicated Hydro trigger like Kokomi, but you can very much also consider Ayato, or honestly a lot of the other Hydro 5 stars or 4 stars like Neuvillette, like Farina, like Xingqiu, Yelan. Candace also is one of the better options for sure, but when you're playing Candace, she is not the only one triggering, right? Which is why I'm naming her separately. Generally, Candace is played with either Kirara or Yao Yao as the Dendro option, or as the second Dendro option. You can infuse their attacks with Hydro and swap between the two. The other Dendro option generally is Yao Yao or Kirara. You can get away with other options like Kaveh, for example, but it will generally be worse. You can use Alhaitham, which is going to be pretty alright. There is Emily coming out later this patch, but you should not use her in Nilou teams. She is very bad in Nilou teams. Straight up awful. Significantly worse than Cole or Dendro MC, which are also valid options. Cole tends to be a unit that is used a lot in Nilou speedruns because you get to front load a lot of your application, which can quickly finish off a first wave or something like that. Anyways, more Nilou information will be found in the Ask the Jeff Nilou, so you can make sure you subscribe and check that out. But we've already talked a little bit about Kirara, so let's move on to her. Oh, actually no, before I get into that, I want to quickly mention early constellations and signature weapons. Navia's constellations, at least the early constellations, don't tend to be the best. Between constellations and signature, I'd probably go for signature. She's got some decent ones later on, but they're just not really what I'd recommend. If you're playing her with Farina, I'd recommend Farina cons before her cons. Overall, just not the best. And then Nilou is actually pretty interesting. There's a bit of a similar dynamic with Nahida cons over Nilou cons. Nilou's C1 is not very good. It's not completely useless. I think people definitely tend to underestimate what 6 seconds does. 6 seconds is a decent amount more Hydro App, which does make her trigger more blooms. And her blooms actually do reasonable damage even if she's not built with that much EM. However, they do a lot more damage if you have her weapon. which is generally a much stronger option than an early constellation for her. Her C2 is actually pretty good. So is Nahida's C2. I would probably recommend Nahida's C2 over Nilou's C2, especially because of its versatility. But Nilou's C2 is also good. A Dolphin level Nilou team with her signature, her C2, and Nahida's C2 gains a lot from each of those upgrades. So it's something to consider. As usual though, don't spend money on this shit game. But I know some of you guys still want to know how much you gain from those cons. But yeah. Anyways, let's move on to Kirara. Kirara is a Dendro Shielder who honestly doesn't do much outside of Dendro Shielding. She has a burst that actually has relatively high motion value, but it's pretty much her only significant form of damage in her whole kit, and by itself, it's not really enough to justify building her 4 damage instead of for her shield, which means that, because her shield scales with HP, whereas her damage on ult scales with attack, which means that in most situations, her burst just doesn't do too much. Her skill, right, you can hold it to start meowing around, apply some Dendro, but the Dendro up of it is not that good, so generally you don't actually tend to hold it too long. You can short hold to increase the strength of your shield, which is generally what you should be doing, that or tap, but generally short hold for sure. It's the same thing as Sayu, so I could just show it with Sayu, where like you could just use a tap, but if you just hold for long enough for it to register as a hold, and then release, you get more. With Sayu, you can do it because her hold E generates 1 more particle than her tap E. With Kirara, you do it, I think for the same reason. I think it also generates 1 more particle, but also because it makes her shield a bit stronger because of her Ascension 1 passive. Either way, Kirara is a unit that fits in a decent amount of teams, mainly a lot of Quicken teams and Nilou teams. She tends to be one of the better options in short rotation Quicken teams that are reliant on a good defensive option, like Sethos teams, which I haven't talked too much on this channel because I didn't end up making a Sethos post-release, because I didn't end up leveling my Sethos because I hate exploring in the Sumeru Desert. But there has been some new tech found with quick fire short charge shots. Instead of trying to go for his EM scaling, you just go for rapid fire charge attacks, which don't have the EM scaling, but do trigger quicken, and you get a lot more of them, which has given him a little bit more options when it comes to playstyles, and has made him a bit stronger overall. But he's still not like an insane character. He's just, you know, a character you can play. But he does quite like Kirara in his teams because he's a charge shot character. Other than that, I mean, generally quicken teams like Cutman or Kutsing can appreciate having a shielder in the team, and you would much rather run a unit like Kirara instead of replacing your Fischl or something with Zhongwei if you really want a shield. When it comes to Nilou teams, she's a decent option. This is one of the few teams where you actually can find yourself wanting to use her hold E. I would not use her as the only form of defensive utility, so I generally would not recommend Kirara in Nilou teams that aren't using Kokomi as the Hydro. Also, I just realized I didn't mention Barbara earlier. Barbara is also a pretty decent option as the Hydro applicator for Nilou teams. And obviously, if you're using Barbara, then she works as well. Her constellations, her C4 helps with Dendro up, which is nice, but it's not that big of a deal. C6 is a little bit more damage percent, which is fine. I think the main upside from C4 is that it lets you not have to be as perfect in your rotations. Without the C4, she doesn't have a reliable form of off-field application, which means that when you swap off of her, after you've triggered your Quicken, you have a pretty strict, like, 10-ish seconds before the Quicken is over, after which you'll have to swap back onto her to get the Quicken again. Of course, some of the Quicken teams can be a bit of a pain in the ass, so the C4 can be big for those, but when it comes to, like, damage, it's pretty insignificant, and it really doesn't do too much in Nilou teams that aren't that reliant on her application. Next up, Kaveh! Kaveh is a character that is designed around Bloom, and that is pretty bad in Bloom teams. There is no such thing as a non-Nilou Bloom team that is not awful, which means that you would play him in a Nilou team in which the fact that he automatically detonates Bloom seeds doesn't matter because you're getting bountiful Bloom anyways. They're exploding instantly to begin with. So he doesn't really have an upside in teams where he's good because, again, if you try to play him in a Bloom team without Nilou, it just will not be a good team. Kaveh has a team where he's somewhat reasonable, and that is because Kaveh's plunge animation is actually quite fast for a Claymore. He has a special plunge animation. He's one of the very few characters that have a plunge animation that's slightly different from others of their weapon type. And it's because while his windup is pretty much the same, he actually goes down much faster than other characters. Anyways, which means that out of the characters that you can play in a Xianyun C6 Bennett Vape team, just because they suck and you want to be playing them, but they don't have a good team, it works. The main thing that actually makes him good, or not good, but not as bad in the Xianyun plunge teams is that he's a Claymore user, and Claymores have, at a baseline, a much higher multiplier. And because the AoE is centered in front of you a little bit, right? Around here, which is where the Claymore actually hits the ground, right? Around here. Instead of on you, like is the case for Catalyst, or much closer to your body at the very least, when like is the case for swords. The fact that it's a little bit further ahead means that it tends to actually be better at dealing with AoE, because most of the time enemies are centered a little bit ahead of you rather than around you. That being said, don't expect the team to actually be good. You're playing Kaveh, you're not playing a good character. When you're playing these C6 Bennett Xianyun teams, they're always worse than like actual good Xianyun teams. It's just a nice baseline that bad characters can take advantage of to have teams that at least do something. I'm an idiot. But we can kill things, at least, right? So there's that. So you could get better numbers, obviously, if you were to fully ascend him, get his normal attacks properly leveled up. He does have EM Ascension, which is a stat that is actually useful in this team. More useful than in his Nilou teams, honestly, if we're being completely honest with ourselves. So he does have a couple things going for him that are going to make him better than, for example, if you were to play Yunjin in that team. But yeah, honestly, like, I'm going to be honest with you guys, the biggest downside of Kaveh is that his Ascension material is a Sumeru Desert material, which means that you're actually going to have to go in the Sumeru Desert. So sorry about that. I can very quickly go over his constellations. None of them matter. His C4 sounds like it does something, but again, he is awful if you're playing him in a Bloom team without Nilou. Like, you're playing a terrible team, which means that the C4 will never really have value if you're playing him in one of his good teams. It is also worth mentioning that this is not actually 60% more damage. This is a 60% added multiplier onto the EM multiplier, which is already in the like 500 to 600%. If you have your Hydro character with 1000 EM, their EM multiplier is already 630%. So that 60% more damage is actually 10% more damage. He gets a bit more app from C6, which is okay. But yeah, overall, it just really isn't much. And then finally, we have Ning. She is one of the viable options in Navia teams, mainly because there is no second Geo teammate that is that insane to use. I'd say that with Chiori's release, I don't think there's a real argument to be made of her being better. Like, the best second Geo option when you're not using Zhongli, I'd say that Chiori is almost always strictly better, even though Chiori is not that great with Navia, because obviously you're not getting the second doll with her. You can also just use her as a carry in a non-Navia team, but that's also going to be pretty underwhelming. Overall, Ning is a fine unit that just you won't really be playing unless you really like her. If you do really like her and you're playing her as a carry, C1 I think is a lot less useful than young me thought it was. I used to think the C1 was a pretty big deal, and then I grew up and I realized, wait, it doesn't do AoE damage. It says it does, but the AoE's ass. So the C1's not actually that good. C2 is probably her biggest early constellation. If you actually play around the cooldown well, this effectively makes her skill cooldown 6 seconds, because using your skill when you have a Jade screen on the field counts as shattering the Jade screen. You will immediately refresh your cooldown, but then if you use it another time, this effect will be on cooldown, so it'll be a 12-second cooldown this time. That being said, you can still, if it doesn't break by the time you come back to her, you can still do the same thing on the next rotation. Main downside to that is that, unfortunately, there's particle ICD to her skill, which means that she will only generate particles from using her skill up to once every 6 seconds, much like Farazan's charge attacks after her skill. Same reason why Sacrificial Fragments does not increase your particle generation on her, because you just don't get particles from the second one, so keep that in mind. But her skill is actually her main form of AoE damage, and it actually does relatively significant damage. It's not like an insane amount, but it is pretty good. So if you can get 2 skills in a row like this is a good amount of front-loaded AoE damage, which AoE damage tends to be her weakness, so it's good to know about it. Also good to know that her skill AoE. I don't remember if it's a cylinder or a sphere. I think it's a cylinder. But it is not actually just hitting on the wall. It's a cylinder around the wall. It's a 10-meter diameter cylinder, which means you don't need to try to get the wall to be hitting the enemy itself. It's actually a pretty generous AoE anyways. Other constellations like C3 is fine. C5 is arguably better than C3 because it increases the part of her damage that's AoE, so it's kind of alright to get. And then C6 obviously gets you a strong charge attack after your ult. Before that C6, her single target damage is really bad. After that C6, it's pretty bad, but it's less bad. It's a lot better. Overall, it's fine. But yeah, she doesn't have the best constellations, and she's not at a baseline that good of a character. Definitely one of the worst characters to get on a banner like this. Same for Kaveh, although I'm aware that a lot of people are glad he's here because they didn't get him on his first run, and it has been over a year by now. As usual, right? Like, I'm talking about the character's actual like meta power, but if you want a character because you want them for a non-meta reason, then obviously that supersedes any talk of their meta strength or whatever, right? That being said, do be careful wishing for a specific 4-star. You can end up sinking 200 wishes on the banner before getting it. And Kirara, I would say, is about average, maybe above average. She's a pretty decent character for there to be. However, we're also getting her for free in an event in this patch. And like I said, her constellations outside of her C4 don't tend to do that much. So it's not actually that bad or that good of a character either. Like, her being on banner is a lot worse because she's also free in the same patch than it would be if she wasn't also given for free. That being said, both of the 5-stars on the banner are above average. They're both characters that are quite overall strong. Nilou specifically has some synergy with Kirara. Navia to some extent some synergy with Ning if you don't have Chiori. I generally wouldn't really recommend Ning over a character like DOMC or Dongli if you have him. And then Nilou, Kirara is a pretty good option for her for sure. Overall, really underwhelming 4-stars, but definitely above average 5-stars. I'd say these are relatively average banners, like all things considered. I think if you wanted either of these characters, I can understand being disappointed with a 4-star lineup. But if you're like a new player who's thinking of getting some of these characters, the 5-stars themselves are definitely strong enough to potentially justify that. Then when it comes to the weapon banner, Verdict is pretty good. The biggest downside from Verdict is that it's not actually that much better than Serpent Spine. The biggest upside from Verdict is that you don't have to play Serpent Spine, which is often very, very annoying because in order for Serpent Spine to be as good as people calc it to be, you need to wait 20 seconds at the start of your chamber, and the gap between Verdict and non-pre-stacked Serpent Spine is obviously a lot bigger. But again, right, I like keep in mind Verdict, the main reasons to go for Verdict is because you like the drip or you hate having to wait for Serpent Spine. Not actually to make your runs faster, unless you don't have Serpent Spine at all because you don't buy the Battle Pass, in which case, obviously, it can be alright. And then Key, very much in contrast to that, is actually quite a good weapon. It is obviously by far Nilou's best weapon. It's a good option for Farina in general, and it's a great option for Farina in teams where she's triggering Vape. Competitive, if not stronger, than her signature in those teams. It's also a quite strong option on characters like Kuki, for example, where you just care about the EM. I mean, technically, Kuki kind of cares about the HP too, but that part doesn't really matter, at least for her damage. But it just actually gives you enough EM that it's generally your best weapon. And obviously, if you're playing Kuki in a Quicken team rather than just a straight Hyper Bloom team, sharing the Elemental Mastery with the rest of your team is also going to be a damage increase for them. If you are approaching this banner as a Nilou player, it's a relatively disappointing one because Verdict is not a particularly versatile 5-star weapon. And even on even on Navia, it's not that big of an upgrade over Serpent Spine if you're willing to wait for the Serpent Spine stacks, potentially even losing out to max refined Serpent Spine in some situations. However, if you are a Navia player who wants to get Verdict for Navia, this is, I think, a pretty good lineup for the 5-star weapons. Key is definitely one of the more useful 5-star weapons overall for an account. But then you look at the 4-star lineup, and honestly, it's really not good. Xiphos is a good weapon. However, at low refinement, it isn't even really better than Fav. Even at high refinement, in a lot of situations, it's worse than Fav on the characters where it's good. It's mainly good for Kuki, but Kuki herself doesn't care about the ER you get from it, so it's not even that great for her. It's fine fine on like Nilou. It's okay on Kazuha, but again, Fav just tends to be so good on him that it isn't even necessarily an upgrade. Zyphos is one of those weapons that, like, on paper, it is a pretty good weapon, but it's actually not that much of an upgrade on anyone. One character on which Zyphos is actually a significant upgrade is probably Ayato and Nilou teams, and that's kind of it. Or yeah, if you're a low investment Kazuha and it's difficult for you to get enough crit to proc the Fav. But yeah, so it's fine. Like, it's definitely above average. It's better than something like Lion's Roar, but it's not as important as a lot of people think, in my opinion. And then the rest of the lineup is pretty bad. Dragon's Bane is okay, but as I've mentioned way too many times now because it's on every other banner. One, it's on every other banner, so you probably already have it. And two, it's a weapon where the refinements on it only matter on like Hu Tao, because on Xiangling you're probably not using it. You're probably using Catch instead. And on Raiden, if you're using her in Hyperloom teams, the refinements don't do anything. So it tends to be a weapon that most people aren't really happy to see on a banner, because either you already have it and don't care about refinements, or honestly, you've been playing for long enough that you already have it at R5 anyways. Bell is really bad. I have Perception, not particularly good. And Rust, not particularly good either. If you're a Yoimiya player, it's okay, but that would pretty much only be for Yoimiya players that specifically want like Verdict very much or Key very much. And then on top of that, it's not even that much better than Slingshot. I think a low refine just is worse than Slingshot, and depending on the team you play her, there are situations where even at high refines it isn't as good as Slingshot, or at least is very similar. And then on other characters, it's just not particularly good. It's a fine option on Child, but it's worse than weapons like Stringless, for example. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Overall, the 4-star lineup is really, really bad. Definitely significantly below average. And then the 5-star lineup, I think, again, right? If you were wanting Key, it's a pretty underwhelming one, because Verdict is not a great second weapon for there to be on a banner. If you wanted Verdict, it's actually pretty good, because Key is alright. And a lot of the characters where Key is good, Zyphos is also at least a reasonable option. So you manage to get Verdict early and get a Zyphos on the way, you're also probably pretty happy with that. All in all, below average banner. Pretty sad for people that were waiting for a Key rerun / Nilou rerun. And then the character banners, again, right? Overall, pretty average banners with below average 4 stars, but above average 5 stars. But yeah, that's gonna be it for the banner review. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned a thing or two. By the time this video goes live, I should have posted my Elden Ring Day 1 video on the second channel, so we will leave a link in the description for that. Make sure you go give it a watch if that's something you're interested in. Make sure you subscribe to the second channel, subscribe to this one too if you're not already, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.